Lessons from the worst financial decisions of the famous are far more valuable than their greatest triumphs, precisely because failure strips away storytelling ego and hindsight heroics, revealing the raw mechanics of how intelligent, experienced, and well-resourced people still manage to make devastating mistakes. When financial celebrities fail, they do not fail because they lacked information access or intelligence. They fail because under pressure, success, reputation, and unchecked confidence quietly distort judgment. And it is in these distortions that the most transferable lessons live. The first and most recurring mistake among famous financial figures is overconfidence, born from past success. Success is a powerful teacher, but it teaches selectively. It reinforces what worked while obscuring what was merely tolerated by favorable conditions. Many catastrophic decisions began after long winning streaks when individuals subconsciously upgraded their identity from participant in a probabilistic system to exception to the rules. At that point, risk no longer felt like risk. Leverage seemed manageable. Concentration felt justified. Warning signs were interpreted as noise rather than signal. The market, indifferent to reputation, eventually corrected this misinterpretation with force. Another common failure is narrative entrapment. Famous investors often become associated with a particular worldview. Value investing tech, optimism, macro pessimism, real estate dominance, and once the public media and even peers begin to expect consistency, changing one's mind becomes psychologically expensive. Many disastrous decisions were not made because the individual lacked doubts, but because acting on those doubts would have required publicly contradicting their established image. Instead of adapting, they defended. Instead of resizing risk, they doubled down. In this way, identity became leverage, and leverage eventually became collapse. Leverage itself deserves special attention. In nearly every infamous financial failure, excessive leverage played a central role. What is striking is not that leverage was used, but how its risk was framed. Famous decision-makers often believed they understood leverage better than others, which was true technically, but false behaviorally. They underestimated how leverage compresses time. It removes the ability to wait. It turns being early into being wrong. Many famous figures were not wrong in direction, but they were wrong in timing, and leverage ensured they would not survive long enough to be proven right. Another repeating pattern is complexity masquerading as sophistication. As wealth and influence grow, financial structures tend to become more elaborate. Derivatives stack on top of derivatives. Entities multiply. Strategies diversify in theory, while concentrating risk in practice. Famous investors often trusted these structures because they built them, or because equally famous peers validated them. Complexity created an illusion of control while actually reducing transparency. When stress arrived, nobody fully understood the system they were inside, including its architects. Complexity did not fail loudly. It failed silently until it failed all at once. Social reinforcement is another invisible accelerant of bad decisions. Famous individuals rarely operate in isolation. They are surrounded by capable, ambitious, and often financially dependent teams. In such environments, dissent becomes costly. Subordinates hesitate to challenge assumptions. Advisors soften language. Peers reinforce confidence through shared exposure. This echo chamber effect is subtle and deadly. Many famous failures were preceded by a long absence of serious internal opposition, not because the ideas were flawless, but because disagreement felt disloyal or career-limiting. There is also the failure of incentive blindness. Some of the worst decisions occurred when famous figures operated within systems that rewarded short-term performance scale or visibility more than durability. Even individuals who intellectually understood long-term risk found themselves nudged by incentives toward fragility. Bonus structures, investor expectations, and competitive pressure distorted behavior incrementally. No single decision looked reckless. Each step felt reasonable. Only in hindsight does the path reveal itself as a straight line toward collapse. Another lesson emerges from ignoring personal limits. Fame and success often create the illusion of infinite capacity. Decision-makers stretch themselves across too many domains, strategies, or geographies. Attention fragments. Depth is replaced by delegation without sufficient oversight. Famous failures frequently involve individuals operating far outside their original circle of competence, not because they were incapable, but because success convinced them that learning curves no longer applied. The market punishes this belief ruthlessly. Timing errors are also central. Many infamous financial mistakes involved entering late into trends that had already rewarded others handsomely. Fame creates proximity to opportunity, but it also creates exposure to pressure. When everyone around you is winning, restraint feels like incompetence. Famous investors are not immune to FOMO. They simply experience it at larger scale. The worst decisions often came not from ignorance, but from impatience. From the feeling that sitting out was riskier than joining in, even when valuations, leverage, and sentiment all suggested danger. What makes these failures especially instructive is how rarely they involved a single bad decision. Instead, they were the result of accumulated small compromises. Risk limits relaxed slightly, leverage increased gradually, complexity grew incrementally, dissent faded quietly. Each step was survivable. Together, they created fragility. By the time the final trigger arrived, the outcome was already determined. The famous did not fall because of one mistake. They fell because they stopped respecting the conditions that made survival possible. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is that intelligence offers no immunity. In fact, intelligence can accelerate failure by providing better justifications for poor behavior. Smart people are excellent at rationalizing why rules no longer apply to them. Famous financial failures are filled with brilliant explanations that were internally coherent and externally disastrous. The market does not reward coherence, it rewards alignment with reality, and reality does not negotiate. Yet within these failures lies the most practical wisdom available. Those who studied famous collapses carefully did not walk away with fear. They walked away with humility. They learned that the true edge is not brilliance, but restraint. Not confidence, but margin. Not visibility, but survivability. The worst decisions of the famous become roadmaps of what to avoid, highlighting the few behaviors that reliably destroy even the strongest positions. And it is precisely here, where failure stops being an embarrassment and becomes a teacher, that the conversation must continue. Because understanding the worst financial decisions of the famous is incomplete unless we examine how some of them recovered, how others refused to adapt, and how the internal responses to failure ultimately determined whether these mistakes became temporary setbacks or permanent endings. And it is from this unresolved point, where collapse meets choice and character is finally tested, that the story needs to move forward as the sentence continues, and that continuation reveals that the moment after failure is far more decisive than the failure itself. Because collapse does not end, careers, denial, does. When famous financial figures faced their worst decisions, the ones who eventually recovered did not do so by explaining, defending, or reframing the past. For public comfort, they did so by shrinking first, psychologically, structurally, and behaviorally. This contraction phase is uncomfortable and deeply unglamorous, yet it is the only terrain on which recovery is possible. The first internal response that separated recovery from ruin was acceptance without self-destruction. Those who survived acknowledged error fully, not selectively. They did not blame markets, regulators, short sellers, or bad luck, even when those factors played a role. They asked a harder question: what part of my behavior allowed this exposure to exist at all? This distinction matters because blaming external forces preserves ego, but prevents learning, while total self-condemnation destroys confidence. The rare discipline was holding responsibility without annihilating identity, seeing the mistake as something they did not, something they were. Behaviorally, recovery almost always began with de-risking. Leverage was cut dramatically. Complexity was dismantled. Positions were reduced to sizes that no longer produced emotional urgency. Many famous figures who recovered took years operating far below their prior scale, managing less capital, making fewer decisions, accepting returns that would have once felt beneath them. From the outside, this looked like decline. Internally, it was rehabilitation. By lowering stakes, they restored clarity, and clarity is the prerequisite for sound judgment. Another defining step was rebuilding opposition. After failure, those who endured actively sought disagreement. They restructured teams, replaced echo chambers, and empowered people who were willing to say no. This was not symbolic. It was structural. They understood that their previous environment had insulated them from reality, and unless that insulation was removed, new strategies would eventually repeat old mistakes. Recovery, therefore, was not about finding better ideas, but about installing better friction. Their relationship with confidence also changed permanently. Pre-failure confidence was expansive and identity-driven. Post-failure confidence became conditional and process-based. They trusted systems, not instincts. They respected uncertainty rather than trying to dominate it. Even when success returned, it carried a different tone, quieter, less performative, more reversible. This is why those who recovered rarely returned to their former public persona. The scar tissue altered their behavior for good. By contrast, those who did not recover followed a different path. They explained instead of examined. They doubled down instead of resized. They clung to narratives instead of updating models. Most critically, they treated recovery as a reputational exercise rather than an internal one. Press tours replaced restructuring. Defensiveness replaced curiosity. These figures often remained visible for a time, but their relevance decayed as reality diverged further from their self-story. Markets eventually moved on without them. One of the most underappreciated lessons from famous failures is how long recovery actually takes. Years, sometimes a decade. Not because opportunities were absent, but because trust, internal and external, had to be rebuilt slowly. Those who rushed this process almost always stumbled again. The discipline to remain small, quiet, and patient during recovery is rarer than the discipline to take risk during expansion. It requires enduring anonymity after fame, restraint after excess, and doubt after certainty. The final lesson is both sobering and empowering. The worst financial decisions of the famous were not unique mistakes made by exceptional people. They were amplified versions of ordinary human errors: overconfidence, identity, attachment, incentive, blindness, and fear of standing alone. The difference is scale. Studying these failures is valuable, not because we are likely to manage billions, but because the same patterns operate at every level. The cost is simply proportional, and so the story resolves not as a warning to avoid risk, but as a guide to avoid fragility. Failure is not the enemy. Unexamined success is. The famous who fell and rose again teach us that humility is not a moral posture, it is a survival strategy, and that the market's harshest lessons are not designed to punish, but to expose the exact point where judgment stopped being governed by reality and started being governed by ego. If this exploration of famous financial failures has sharpened how you think about risk, confidence, and recovery, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and continue these long-form reflections together, and leave a comment, sharing which failure pattern you believe is most dangerous and most common today. Because learning from the worst mistakes of others is one of the few advantages that does not require paying full tuition yourself.